Hi, everyone. Well, thanks for joining. As most of you know, we've been running Facebook Live sessions over the last, must be about a month or so now, and really trying to help, our clients, but the broader business community with all of the tricky legal issues and practical issues coming out of the COVID-19 situation. What we've decided to do on this session, obviously we're doing it on GoToWebinar. The reason for that is we've got Kyle Hutchin joining us from Shanks. So Kyle is a tenant representative. What he does is he basically helps tenants negotiate with landlords. Now in the good days, Kyle's busy negotiating for growing tech startups and the like, helping them get into new premises and make sure that they've kind of structured things in a way that's going to work best from a leasing perspective. Obviously, right now, he's helping a lot of clients with the commercial negotiations that go with, dealing with the unfortunate current economic situation. So, Kyle, do you want to just give a brief background on yourself and Shanks, and then we'll kind of get into some of the questions?
Yeah, sure. So, look, I think everybody generally understands the role of a leasing agent in kind of the broader ecosystem and landlords. A lot of people aren't aware that there's a much smaller kind of division of us out there who only represent tenants' interests in the broader market. And as you said, Lachlan, usually it's around transaction management, et cetera, where people are taking new leases or growing. So the difference obviously is when you're dealing with an agent, normally, even if they are quote unquote representing you in the market, ultimately they're paid for and their client is paid by, and their client is the landlord and the property owner. So I'm fully retained by tenants. As Lachlan alluded to, we're probably very well known in the industry for the pretty extensive group of tech clients that we represent. So we've been really across this whole really weird scenario that we're all living through. And generally speaking, I think there's probably a lot of uncertainty still. And Lachlan and I will probably talk about how much stuff is still uncertain or unclear. But ideally, we can kind of focus on giving you guys the best tips and kind of ideas and strategies to really navigate this. And we're relatively fortunate if you're in New South Wales that we have a little bit more framework and a little bit more certainty around kind of the application of the National Tenancy, National Cabinet Code of Conduct. But that still doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of weird and wild and wonderful situations out there. So hoping everybody's safe, but yeah, absolutely, Lachlan, let's get right into this and figure out how we can help some people navigate some pretty weird situations.
Great. So look, we've got about an hour. Obviously, the way we do these is people submit questions throughout the course of the discussion, and so everyone feel free to do that. You just type into the chat box. We've already got a whole bunch of questions. But before we get into those, I wanted to kind of have a bit of a chat with Kyle about the more commercial side of things, and in particular, assuming that the vast majority of attendees today are tenants, and obviously you understand your own personal circumstances very well, I think it would be super useful for Kyle to give some insight into landlords, and in particular, in this current environment, what the kind of drivers of a landlord are. Because if you understand better what a landlord's actually kind of looking for, you're going to position yourself better to be able to negotiate, in the current environment. So let's get into, I guess, some of the different types of landlords. Do you want to kind of run through the gamut of the types of landlords that we'd be dealing with?
Sure. So there's basically two principal categories of landlords. You have private landlords and you have institutional landlords, right? So institutional landlords are landlords who make money purely and simply by being landlords, or consequently as well by developing property and then owning and managing it. So companies like Murdoch, who are both developer but also obviously very much an institutional landlord, ISPT. Look, in Australia, it's a lot of REITs and then also a lot of superannuation funds. Superannuation funds are some of the biggest institutional landlords. So ultimately, institutional landlords, more often than not, I'd struggle to think of anybody who's purely private, have to keep their shareholders happy, right? And a lot of this has to do with, we can get into it a little bit later, but institutional landlords are often driven by managing kind of the two different sets of books that they'll have. So there'll be what we call face values on a building, which deal with basically how the bank values the building, how the building is valued from an advertised perspective. And then there's essentially the actual. And the difference between those two is what many of you, if you have a commercial lease, would have experienced as hearing about incentive, right? So when you enter into a lease, particularly institutional landlords, there'll be a degree of incentive. It's usually kept on a separate document. It's not on the lease, doesn't go in the titles registration. It's not public information. That's separate, etc. So institutional landlords are driven by a much longer term view of property than private landlords, which are the second category. Now, I kind of break private landlords into two little subcategories. Basically, you have mom and pops, and you then have principally family offices, okay? So mom and pops would be, you know, Lori and Ken down the street pooled their money, took their self-managed super, and bought a shop front on Campbell Parade in Bondi Beach. I mean, they have to be doing pretty well to buy a shop front in Bondi Beach, but you take my point, they have maybe one location, it's their baby, it's their nest egg, and it's everything that matters to them, right? The second one, you know, family offices or more sophisticated investors, again, it may not be their core way of making money, but they may have a couple of different properties around here. So the short of it is private landlords are overwhelmingly driven by cash flow. So if you have a private landlord, then you probably noticed when you were negotiating your lease that incentive was offered maybe as some rent-free, but probably more as what we call rental abatement or like a discount over the life of your lease. Commercial or institutional landlords probably offered you incentive as your choice, and often they'll throw cash at you to improve your actual tenancy you're building. So I guess that bringing this full circle, the way to understand when you're entering into negotiations is a lot of institutional landlords, their building values and everything else are driven by what we call weighted average lease expiry. How long do the leases in the building go as an average? So the more term, the longer term you can possibly offer an institutional landlord, the happier they're generally going to be, you know, unless there's a development plan. But in general, that's what they're going to be looking for, is a longer term, because it gives them a better valuation that they can sell the building on. And unless you've been under a rock, you know that buildings in Sydney and Brisbane and everywhere around the country are being sold like hotcakes and like they're going out of style. Private landlords are going to be focused, again, on cash flow. So the number one thing, if you're negotiating with a landlord, and you know, we can get into the specifics, Lachlan, later, like we talked about with what you're actually entitled to relief-wise, but the number one thing will be trying to come to some sort of agreement or outcome with a private landlord, which still guarantees them cash flow, because they're probably cash poor as a general perspective. If you take my point, you know, obviously if they're owning property, they must have something, but ultimately at the end of the day, they're relying upon that income to pay their mortgage. So understanding, you know, that it's very different drivers that are going to be operating in the backgrounds is really key, I think, to achieving the outcomes in any negotiation, even during these kind of unprecedented times that we're living through now.
I think even more so in these unprecedented times, because if we look at the, and we'll start getting into the details of it now, I guess, of the leasing code of conduct, it's really a framework designed to enable landlords and tenants to obviously negotiate an outcome, but it has some guidance given it. It has a kind of base, you know, guidance, which is that you know, if you qualify for JobKeeper, and broadly we're talking about here businesses that'll qualify for JobKeeper, so I've had that 30% dip in revenue as calculated on their business activity statement, GST turnover on a month-to-month or quarter-to-quarter basis, then you fall under this code of conduct. And the code of conduct basically says that, for the amount of revenue decrease that you've seen, you should get half of that as a waiver and half of that as a deferral of rent. Now, the interesting thing there is, of course, that's just guidance. It's kind of, it's guidance, and you can negotiate something that's different to that. And if your business is one that's going to benefit from potentially a bigger waiver now, but no deferral down the track, or vice versa, the type of landlord that you're dealing with is going to be very important, because clearly, from what you've just said there, Kyle, a sort of mum and pop style landlord is going to be more focused on cash right now because they've got their mortgage to pay.
Yeah, correct. So I think that's a really good leeway into, I can cover off some kind of interesting and relevant case studies where we've applied this in real world. So, it comes down to kind of what the tenant is entitled to, right, under the code that's been released and more recently what's been put in place in New South Wales. But again, as Lachlan stressed, the legislation is very clear that tenants can elect to kind of come to an agreement with the landlord that is different. So Lachlan's absolutely right. Half of the rental relief package, at least minimum of half, must be offered as a waiver. But the tenant has the ability to say, no, I don't have to take it as a waiver. So again, I think it's really important. It's not to say that there won't be adversarial situations out there, but I think trying to come to the table in a productive, constructive fashion, realizing that we're all hurting during this time, we're all going through a difficult period, and coming to a constructive agreement will probably get you a lot more friends, particularly for a longer term agreement than elsewise. So an example I'd give you is I have a client where we've negotiated a rental relief package. And while they were entitled to about a 55 or 60% reduction, and a quick aside, just recognize that if you are eligible under the code, the minimum reduction that you should be asking for is 30%, because that's the minimum trade that you're down as per your JobKeeper application. But they were entitled to 55 or 60%. We ended up actually being in a position where we went back to the landlord and said, listen, we can afford a 45% reduction, and we'll compromise and we'll share the pain and we'll take a 45% reduction, but we would like to agree a set period up front where this is in place for the next 3 months. And the landlord was really happy. Private landlord came back to us and said, this works for me. I can deal with that hit and I can deal with that time period, and we'll revisit it. But the alternative was that we were going to be a situation where it would be potentially a month-to-month review. And the danger, obviously, is because I think, as Lachlan can tell you, being a lawyer, interpretation is always the ultimate question. The biggest thing that we see, being not lawyers, is this whole, how do you interpret a reasonable recovery period that's in the code of conduct? So if we had agreed a 60% reduction for April or May, and then Scott Morrison lifts the restrictions halfway through May, does that mean that June is due in full? So for us, it was really important that we knew, no matter what, even looking at things and everything changing, we needed a 3-month runway. And we were willing to compromise slightly on our position in order to get that guaranteed underneath the business. So again, I think it's about trying to find the compromise that works, but also my advice always to tenants is know what you are entitled to and know what you are able to reach out and touch on this stuff. And I have had tenants where the landlord sent a letter and said, we don't think that the code of conduct applies. We'll offer you a 25% reduction for this month, but in signing this, you waive your ability to negotiate future claims. As you can imagine, those are absolutely situations where you just really need to tread carefully. And I don't want to be perceived as giving any legal advice here whatsoever, but obviously in those types of situations, I think you need to step back and realize that maybe someone is trying to take advantage of the situation, and to be fair, that they're hurting in too. and push something through that may not be the best deal that your business has a right to achieve.
I think what you kind of talked about there in terms of the certainty of the time period is massive, not just for the tenancy side of things, but on JobKeeper, obviously the government's come out and said this is a 6-month program and so on and so forth.
Yep.
But over the last week or so, as the medical situation's obviously improved dramatically, there've been sort of messages coming out of Canberra that JobKeeper might be kind of pared back and so on and so forth. It'll be reviewed at the end of June, so on and so forth. So I think, no doubt, I would not be relying on JobKeeper lasting for 6 months, and certainly I wouldn't be relying on, the kind of tenancy code, sort of operating for that kind of 6-month period. So locking in a deal that gives you certainty is incredibly valuable. The other thing, of course, worth mentioning is if you're in a situation where your rent is a substantial, percent of your cost base on a monthly basis, and you've got to under the code, you're kind of on a month-to-month basis, getting a waiver and deferral of rent based on the amount of reduction in revenue. You're in some ways perversely incentivized to, avoid generating revenue, and that's not a way you want to be running your business. So if you can lock in, the certainty of we've got the waiver, we've got the deferral for 3 months or 4 months or 5 months or whatever it is, get that locked in, then you can be like full guns blazing on focusing on your business and making sure that you're focusing on top line revenue without that knowledge that every dollar of additional revenue you generate means a reduction in the in the waiver and that you're getting on the rent. So all these things come into it.
I'm not a fan of turnover rents to begin with, and I certainly don't think that people should be treating it like a turnover rent and trying to, to a degree, kind of avoid or skim as much as they can to not have to get hit with that extra cost. It's definitely something I think as well where the way that we've approached it with some of the landlords has been, and I think my advice to a lot of business owners is, this is a great moment to kind of look at your systems and processes and a great moment to examine, well, what does your sales cycle look like? So if business as usual in Australia goes back tomorrow, how long is your sales cycle and activities going to take to get you back into a positive revenue generation type situation? So, in our discussions with landlords, it was because we looked at it and we basically said, well, okay, no matter what, it looks like it's getting better based on the medical situation, but we probably have a 6 to 8 week runway before things can resume on revenue. So from that basis, we basically said we need the 1 month, and then we probably need 8 weeks on the other side, at least guaranteed, to give us runway to get back up to normal. So those types of conversations, and again, being open and honest and transparent with the landlord, to say, look, I sell, a very complex widget or service. Our sales cycle is X. This is how long we think it's going to take us to get back up to normal. I think that's a more productive conversation than simply saying we want 6 months off or whatever it may be. It's not to say that you may not be entitled to that. It's just about how you approach it to be a constructive conversation, because ultimately a lease is like a set term marriage. You're going to have to live with this person for a while, particularly because this is probably a lease in progress. So best to try and get through this with as minimal collateral damage as possible to the relationship.
Definitely. Before we get into the questions, I've got a question for you on the institutional landlords. Are you seeing the institutional landlords coming out with a kind of a set offer that they're offering to all of their tenants, or?
So I was just doing another webinar earlier today, and we were putting in some anecdotal evidence, but a completely non-scientific survey of the institutional landlords in Sydney CBD by us has that about 60 to 80% of tenants have requested some form of relief. Now, I don't know how many of them have been granted. I will say that institutional landlords are being quite, at least in our opinion, at times very aggressive in pushing the documentation side and saying, you know, I want 5 years of audited P&Ls, plus I want your, you know, I want your blood type and your dental records going back 30 years. You know, I mean, some of these requests, I've seen 15 to 20 page rent relief documentation requests. I've had people get asked for their bank statements if they have director's guarantees on the lease, which is a big no-no, but I've had them been asked for their bank statements. I mean, some of these, look, the point of everything is you should be providing some evidence, as Lachlan mentioned, to justify all of this. A lot of that evidence is actually going to be pulled straight from the JobKeeper application, right? Sure. It's almost identical to a lot of the documentation you would have submitted to be eligible anyway. So institutionals are probably trying to, I don't know if I'd accuse them of dragging their feet, because I think that's probably unfair. We're all trying to figure it out. But I would say that some of the documentation requests are a bit onerous. The other thing I can tell you is institutional landlords up until, at least up until New South Wales implemented it. So I haven't actually checked back to see if this has changed since. But after the mandatory code of conduct was passed by the National Cabinet on and put out there on April 7th, we saw institutionals begin grading tenants, right? So the retail tenants that were in the basement, unable to trade completely, those were the #1 priority to get rent relief. The SMEs were another one, and then you had some of the larger anchor tenants, et cetera, that were essentially top of the pile, swamped with documentation requests, and we're probably never going to get rent relief unless they really made a compelling case. So I think institutionals have also taken the view that there's probably a lot of people out there, a lot of tenants out there that are going to seize advantage of the climate and may ultimately possibly try to take the piss. So I think it's important as well, if you are negotiating with institutionals, to again remember that they are dealing with thousands of tenants all coming to them saying we can't pay our rents. So forgive them to a degree, putting my landlord empathy hat on. If there's probably a little bit of rent relief fatigue, I think we all are feeling a bit of fatigue in these negotiations, and probably there's a bit of cynicism on the other end. And is it fair? Maybe not, but just keep that in mind. 80% of their tenants are requesting it. Have your ducks in a row, your documentation ready to go, stick to your guns, know your rights, and just be pleasant and open and transparent. Nobody needs to get adversarial here.
So before we get into the question, well, that's exactly right. So, the sort of mindset of a sort of institutional landlord, you mentioned that, the institutional landlords are all about the length of the leases and so on and so forth. Yep. So is going in there with an offer to potentially extend the term of your lease with a reduced rent for the whole from now to the new end of term? Are they the kind of deals that you're seeing happening, or?
So the market's definitely lagging a bit with regards to this whole COVID pandemic and the impacts on commercial real estate. And what I mean by that is there's not, I had a few clients who back in March said, let's put things on hold, let's wait, there's going to be tons of space coming out. Hasn't materialized yet. I think in the next 3 to 6 months, it very well might. There very well may be a huge wave of subleases, a huge wave of smaller SMEs going under. But right now, it's not. And Ray White Commercial actually released the latest figures in Sydney, I think last week. And that's for the first quarter, including March. And Sydney was 3.6% vacancy premium, 2.6% A grade, 5% and change on B. Most markets, when they're at 6-7% vacancy as a blended average, they're putting up a sign saying, no room, right? So Sydney is one of the tightest markets in the world. hands down, and we just haven't seen it yet. So it's hard from that degree. I think, Lachlan, you got to balance. You got to balance it. I have to not sound too cynical here, but if I'm a landlord and you're coming to me saying I can't pay any rent, but hey, I'm happy to extend my lease on my business, which is going out of business, I'm probably less impressed, right? If you have a really good underlying covenant, if you have a really good business model that's just genuinely being impacted by this whole weirdness that's going on, absolutely, I think that's the first thing that you should talk to them about, particularly if you're not eligible for the code. So a quick distinction. If you are eligible under the code and you're negotiating rent relief, you have the option, but not the obligation as a tenant, to extend your lease for a period equal to the rent relief period that you seek. So if you take 3 months of rent relief, you have the option, but not the obligation, to extend your lease term by 3 months. Now, Lachlan is in a better position than me to tell you, well, what happens if they're going to knock the building over at the end of it? You know, there's a
not
lot
sure
of,
that I am really.
yeah, there's a lot, and we were talking about this before this started. There's a lot of gray zone and uncertainty out there, so there's still some questions like that. But you have the ability to extend, right? So if you come to your institutional landlord, you have a strong business, you want to negotiate your lease expiry, which was 6 months away now, and say, look, as part of me renewing now, can we talk about me not paying rent for a few months, et cetera? Then absolutely, that's something that's probably top of mind, particularly if you can achieve it this financial year. So that's the other point I'd quickly make. Institutional landlords are prepping for a bloodbath. If you can potentially offer them a sweet new transaction to get put into their books this financial year, they will likely come to the table as much as they can, because at this point it's stemming the losses, right? But just recognize that on the other side of FY20, it's a blank slate. And then the focus is going to be, let's rebuild profit. So they may not be as willing and desperate, frankly, as they are in the current situation to just book something, anything that they can.
Yep. Okay, that's good. All right. Well, look, let's. I think we've really focused on kind of the big picture. Hopefully, given everyone some idea of the kind of top level, the way that landlords are thinking, and some of the things that Kyle's obviously seeing in the market on a day-to-day basis. I think what we'll do now is jump into the questions, and obviously that gets more specific. But I mean, obviously the goal here is to try and help as many people as possible. So we'll just go through as many questions as we can, have a discussion around them. If your question isn't answered, and I'll be honest, we've got hundreds of questions here, so they're not all going to be answered. But if it hasn't been answered, please do get in touch. Just give us a call on 1300 544 755. Send us an email through to legalvision.com.au. And obviously, if it's something you need Kyle's help with, we'll put you in touch with Kyle. If it's something you need legal help with, we can obviously assist as well. But let's jump into the questions now. So first question we've got is, can a business get out of a lease completely without having to pay any further rent? What's your view on this, Kyle?
No. Certainly not under the code. So the principle of the code and what we've seen implemented in New South Wales is that essentially it's contingent upon the tenant honoring their ongoing obligation. Now, interestingly, a little bit of legal gossip, and Lachlan, you may have heard this as well. I think Victoria was there were whispers going around that Victoria thinks maybe they should put a break clause in to allow businesses that aren't going to make it through the other side of this the ability to terminate their lease and get out of it. But my general view on this is no. I would struggle to see any way that you're out of it. If you have a personal guarantee on it, I think it's probably going to really be extremely, extremely difficult to get away from those obligations. Obviously, somebody like Lachlan could tell you what your protections are if you have a business that it probably isn't going to survive, and how you could deal with, wrapping up your obligations on that front. But, as far as my view is, and I've been asked this by a few tenants, basically, no, it's going to be extremely difficult.
Okay, so here's a question we've been getting quite a bit. I think it's an interesting one because it starts to get more nuanced, right? So if you're a business and you've obviously suffered over the last couple of months, you've seen that 30% dip in revenue, you're eligible for JobKeeper, you're eligible under the code, but your landlord is taking a lot of time to get back to you on your requests for a deferral request for a waiver. Are you able to not pay rent? Can you kind of not?
So yeah, that's a really interesting one. I've been dealing with this a lot. It is for me one of the most frustrating things, because I think particularly when you're coming to somebody and asking for help, you're vulnerable in the first place, and just to ignore somebody who's trying to have a conversation about that is just beyond the pale in my view. But I think there's a couple of things. One is obviously you have the position now, again, in New South Wales, to assert that you are requesting negotiations under the code and under the New South Wales implementation. There is actually a trigger in there, Schedule 5.5.3, that states that if you request and you are eligible, the other party must renegotiate. So if they don't respond, we're going to get into some of my, I don't know if I'd use the word dirty tactics, but aggressive responses. I've sent a few landlords. I've sent a few landlords clear emails requesting because they've ignored me, requesting confirmation from them in writing that they are refusing to negotiate under the mandatory code of conduct, and chuck a read receipt on that email. You'd be amazed how much that tends to get people to pick up the phone and say, no, we're not negotiating, or, we're formulating a response, etc. I think if you are eligible, and you know this beyond the shadow of a doubt, then particularly in New South Wales, you are protected from termination of your lease, re-entry of the premises, detaining of your goods. I mean, there's a laundry list of additional prescribed actions in New South Wales the landlord cannot take if you're eligible as an impacted lessee. So my view, while I can never recommend somebody don't pay rent, if you are eligible and the landlord is not negotiating, I would find it difficult, or let me phrase it a different way. I would certainly keep in mind that the landlord is prohibited from taking action or retaliating against you during or after this pandemic period if you do not pay rent. Read between the lines.
Yeah. So this is an interesting one, because the code does indicate, does kind of set out that a tenant isn't protected by the code if a tenant defaults on its obligations or her obligations, its obligations, to I guess to pay rent. So it's an interesting one, isn't it? That where is the line, and so on and so forth.
If you so there is an exclusion in the New South Wales implementation that they can terminate your lease for other non-COVID related issues. So I think that's probably something where you may see landlords try and get creative about enforcing. So the example that they give is destruction or damage to premises. So if Lachlan, if you were playing cricket out in the LegalVision office and smashing windows and breaking fixtures and fittings left and right, arguably the landlord could determine and terminate your lease for destruction and damage of premises and failure to fix it in a reasonable time frame. But if you're eligible under the code and you weren't paying rent, they could not. So they would go the angle of you damaged it. So if you are in one of those situations, I think you need to always, and this is going back to what I was saying earlier, I always encourage everybody, always know your obligations, particularly your essential terms, your central obligations, and make sure that you're just 100% across that, because you don't want to give a landlord the opportunity to come back and say, well, you know what, you had a broken window for 6 months, you never fixed it. And even though you're in discussions about everything else, that's the angle that they're going to go down. So
yeah, certainly. And I think, broadly, as we kind of look at, the last sort of 2 months, my advice to clients has been, obviously the legal side of things is important, the law is important, legal obligations are important, but we're in an environment which is very different, and where the commerciality of a situation is potentially more important than it was even kind of 2 months ago. So and that's across employment law, it's across leasing, it's across supplier trading and all that sort of thing. So yeah, interesting one. I mean, I think the other reality that needs to be understood is, in an environment where okay, the leasing market might be still quite tight, but I think it's pretty fair to say that rents are going to go down, right? So in an environment where that is what's going to happen in the next few months, is a landlord really going to be keen to terminate the lease of a business that is just having that kind of short-term dip and that's otherwise a good business? Unlikely, because they're paying like kind of top of the market rent, right?
Yeah, and no one wants vacancy risk now, Lachlan. So that is a great point about another lever that you can pull, particularly if you have a lease that expires in the next couple of months. The ability to say to the landlord, listen, I really don't think anybody wants to be trying to lease space right now in the current environment. Like I said, the market hasn't caught up. I can tell you right now, new deals being done out there have fallen off a cliff. So, if you're in a position and the lever that you can pull on is, listen, the option A is you give me rental relief and we're happy to talk about staying on. Option B is you don't, but I'm happy to walk away and my whole team works from home in 2 or 3 months and you can have fun trying to lease the space out. I know if I were a landlord, which one I would choose. 80% of something is far better than 100% of nothing.
Exactly right. So, and I think that's for everyone on the webinar to be thinking that all the time. And this isn't just in relation to the rental side of things. It's in relation to your entire business and how you're running your business right now. Let's get into a couple more questions. This is a good one. Now, what documentation do you need to show, or financials do you need to disclose to justify rent relief?
Yeah, look, that's actually one of those ones where I tend to say consult with your legal or financial counsel about this, because I think it is a bit of a question mark. I certainly think, again, going back and reiterating that the documentation that you would have done to prove eligibility for JobKeeper is going to cover a lot of the same bases that landlords are probably going to want to cover. I think it's worth just quickly stopping on this point, Lachlan, and talk about how one of the frustrations that I've seen is a lot of the requests from landlords deal with impact against historical financials, which for a lot of businesses is not actually nearly as relevant as impact off of future projected earnings or future projected revenue, unless you're a retailer. Right. So for a lot of commercial and particularly for a lot of fast growing tech firms, including those who are pre-revenue or very early stage, they may be in hyper growth mode and they're 200% off their projections, right now, or 80% off their projections right now, but they're still up on last year. But the difference is they have double the headcount that they have from last year. They still need to get some form of rental relief. So it's again one of those gray zone and tricky zones, and I think having a simple financial statement of position, here's where we are, here's where we should have been, and here's where we were historically. You just need to tell the story, and again, try to arrange it in a position where you're making it clear you're trying to work through the situation and honor your obligations under the lease, and this is the relief that you need in order to get through this tough time.
Yeah, certainly in terms of those fast-growing tech businesses, last week the ATO came out with the alternative tests for JobKeeper. Really so, so originally when JobKeeper came out, it was a 30% reduction on an equivalent period last year, as calculated, looking at your GST turnover. And by the way, GST turnover includes overseas revenue. So for the purposes of this piece of legislation and the way the ATO is interpreting it, GST revenue doesn't actually have anything to do with GST, which is a little confusing. But the issue with that, of course, as Kyle said, was fast-growing tech businesses, weren't getting that 30% reduction because they were growing so quickly that the reduction was only, I guess, as against maybe January or even February. and the ATO has come out with some alternative test rules that are designed to enable those fast-growing tech businesses to benefit from JobKeeper in certain circumstances. So important to have a look on the ATO website or talk to your accountant or your lawyer to work out if you do qualify. But again, if you do qualify for JobKeeper, then you immediately fall under the I guess the coverage of the leasing code. And it's an interesting question as to then how do you particularly if you're doing this on a month-to-month basis, how are you showing this? Because if you're a fast-growing business that's looking kind of January to March, by June, are we comparing to March? And these are going to be the things that really start, ultimately being quite confusing. And if we can talk a little bit about what happens in a situation where the landlord and the tenant can't reach agreement. Well, it's supposed to go to mandatory mediation, right? So it'd be interesting to see what happens there.
Yeah, it really will be, and I think going back to earlier, being cautious about how I'm making more of an observation than certainly making a recommendation. If you are in a situation where you're in negotiations, landlord has acknowledged that you are eligible for negotiations under the code, et cetera, but you're not able to come to an agreement and it's heading to mediation, I really would question, the sense in continuing to pay rent that's in dispute during a protected mediation process. So I certainly would always say that tenants should certainly be able to point to and say, we've put this to one side depending on the outcome of the mediation process. But I would question the sense and frankly how easy it would be to get it back if you were in a situation where you were continuing to pay rent while you were in a protected negotiation or mediation.
Yeah, no, another good point there. Let's get to outgoing. So important question here and relevant for nearly everyone. Is there any relief for tenants with outgoings?
Yes, is the short answer. So what we know basically is that there should be a proportionate pass-through of reduction in building outgoings, which may be tied to a reduction in services. So obviously, if they're not cleaning the common areas, if there's a lower degree of building maintenance simply because there's less foot traffic, that should be passed along. But you also shouldn't show up at your office and be like, oh, why is the common area so dirty? It can be linked to a reduction in services. The second thing is that there's a proportionate pass-through of reductions in statutory charges. So that's things like land tax, council rates, insurances. These are all things that as councils and states, et cetera, pass relief measures focused on landlords, the landlords are obliged or dare I say obligated to pass through proportionately, based on how much of the building the tenant is occupying, those reductions that they are achieving. And interesting. Lachlan, I don't want to really pivot, but I think it's an interesting one to maybe briefly touch on the subject of what happens if you have a co-working or serviced office operator who is getting rent relief from their head lessor. Are they obligated to passing on that rent relief to their subtenants, et cetera? For us, I'll say right now, it's a question I'd love to know a more definitive answer on, because it's just a big gray zone. But it just goes back to how are we dealing with these situations? But certainly on outgoings, there should be proportionate pass through of any reductions that the landlord is getting in the statutory charges or in the building outgoings, and those should be passed along to the tenant.
And I think the key thing there is to be looking at your invoices, right? So I think there's a number of, I can imagine a huge number of circumstances where, as a founder, as an entrepreneur, as a small business owner, you can't look at everything, but this is something that you should definitely be looking at. And, I'd imagine if it's something that you're not familiar with or whatever, that's where, Kyle, you kind of step in and help out, or
It's a really good point to bring up. So we talked about now is a really good time if you have the kind of emotional mental bandwidth to get introspective on your business model. So look, in boom times, outgoings audits are often a big part of what we do and we look at, because a lot of times people may not realize, particularly if you're on a net lease where the outgoings is separated from the rent component. Typically, you're given a budgeted outgoings figure at the beginning of the year, right? And oftentimes people, particularly if you have engaged someone like me, a tenant rep, will often negotiate into the heads of agreement or into the lease the ability for you to get a copy of the actual outgoings at the end of the year, or for the ability for you to even sometimes independently audit them, depending on how big you are. I'd say it's often rare that tenants are aware or have ever reviewed or seen what the actual outgoings are, and it begs the question. You really should be looking into that. The other thing that I would quickly highlight.
I mean, how do you know if you're getting the reduction if you didn't know what the amount was at the beginning, right?
That's right. The other point I'd quickly make, and I'll just mention it from a high level because it's a little technical, but if you're on a gross lease where your outgoings are included in your rent, you really want to be careful that you're not getting a compounded rent increase. So if they're not separating the outgoings and increasing the outgoings for whatever inflation, et cetera, and then increasing the net rent and then adding it back into a gross rent, if they're increasing the outgoings and hitting that with a fixed increase year on year, there's actually a double dip effect. And a lot of people never look at it, never request it, never really, give a careful eye to it. But particularly if you're a larger occupier, that can be quite substantial. You're talking about, you might have a 4% increase on top of, which is compounding a 10% increase in outgoings. So it's just, again, a good time, as Lachlan said, get a look at your outgoings, understand what the heck you were paying for in the first place.
Yep. So I just realized this webinar is supposed to actually finish at 3:45, not 4 o'clock. So we've run through quite a bit there. Now, there's a lot of very specific questions that have come through, which, the reality is we could answer, but it would take, a good 3 hours. What I'd be happy to do, if we get, let's say, 100 or so of you who are on the webinar today who want to do another one of these to kind of get more questions answered, be happy to run that. So we'll kind of check in with all of you to see if you want to do that. Obviously, if we can get Kyle on it, I'm sure you can find 45 minutes to do this. But in terms of other assistance, you'll be able to see the handouts on the go-to webinar there. So we've got 6 steps to survive the next 6 months. We've got a contract obligations fact sheet, a loan repayment fact sheet, rental code of conduct fact sheet. We've also got a template for rent relief, which is like a letter you can send to your landlord, basically saying you qualify for JobKeeper and requesting rent relief. For those of you who want to kind of do it on a DIY basis, which makes perfect sense for smaller businesses. For those of you that are running the sort of business where the rent is relatively sizable and you feel like you need the guidance of a rental advocate like Kyle, get in touch and we'll put you in touch with Kyle. I'm sure you're just doing kind of initial chats with everyone to kind of give a view as to whether your services might be useful. So be happy to obviously do that. And then in terms of your broader kind of business on the legal side of things, what we're finding is, this is a phase right now where businesses of all sizes are requiring quite regular assistance and legal help. Our LV Connect product, which is $200 a month, so very cost effective, is designed specifically to help businesses that have regular ongoing legal needs and inquiries. So what you do is you become a member and you book in on our online platform. You can book in a call with any type of lawyer, so a leasing lawyer, an employment lawyer, a contracts lawyer, any of our kind of 60 or so lawyers, and you can have that half-hour, 45-minute conversation with them to get the legal advice you need. It's all included as part of the $200 a month membership. And we also provide big discounts on our fixed fee pricing. So it's a product that's working super well in this environment. I really encourage all of you to, think about whether that might be an option, a cost-effective option that's going to help you get through the next 6 months. And then, beyond that, I just want to thank Kyle for joining. A super insightful conversation, understanding the commercial realities in these situations, I think is so important. And I think, Kyle's really given us that insight into the mind of the landlord, which is so important. And hopefully we can run another one of these if there's enough of you that are interested in doing it again. So thanks again, Kyle, and thank you everyone for joining. It's been another great session. Have a great rest of the week.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.